Well, it's one of those things that if it's right, you don't really notice it. And yet it's probably one of the most important things in our life. It's certainly important in music. I mean, think about it. The worship team, when they get up here each week, if they sing and they play in accordance with it, then the music sounds great. But if even one of the singers or one of the instruments gets off from it, then immediately people are going to notice. It's also true about our physical lives, if you think about it. Our heartbeats, when they're in tune with this, then we live very comfortably. But if our heartbeats get out of tune with it, then there's something wrong, and we have to get that fixed if we want to be able to live. And the same thing is true for us spiritually. When this is in place, when we live according to it, then our lives are going to be fulfilling and joyful. But when we're not in sync with it, our lives are going to be out of whack as well. By now, maybe you figured out that I'm talking this morning about rhythm. And rhythm is really important to our lives. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because actually we find rhythm all throughout the Scriptures. It goes all the way back to God's creation. Now this morning we're going to look primarily at Genesis chapter 4. But before we do that, take your Bibles and open up to Genesis chapter 1 for just a minute. And I want to show you there these rhythms that God built into His creation that are there for us and that are important to us and that are crucial to us living a life that's going to be full of joy and fulfillment. You'll notice that in each day of creation, as you go through the 6 days of creation, there's a rhythm to it, isn't there? We see that God speaks, something comes into existence, and then at the end of that, God says that it is good, right? And there's something else that also happens. If you'll notice at the end of each day, it says something like this. It was evening and it was morning the first day. It was evening and it was morning the second day. It was evening and it was morning the third day. So God establishes this rhythm of days in the creation. Not only that, there's this larger, overarching rhythm that we find in creation as well. We know that God created for 6 days, and then on the seventh day He rests, right? And there's a rhythm that God creates there. The rhythm that becomes the basis later on for the Sabbath. And what we find in our lives is that when we live our lives according to those rhythms, each day when we have this time of rest, actually our days begin with the time of rest. You know, that's from a Jewish standpoint. We're going to see that when we get to the Jewish feast. For the Jews, they consider that the day begins at sunset. And so their day actually begins with a time of rest and then is followed by a time of work. And that happens each day, a time of rest, a time of work. And then there's that bigger rhythm where God tells us that we're to take one day off out of every 7 to rest. And He gives us that example in the Scriptures. And so those rhythms are really important to our lives. This morning, as we get into Genesis chapter 4, we're going to find another rhythm there. One that's introduced not by God, but by man. It comes into our world through the sin that we saw last week that Adam and Eve create. And though it's not something that's positive for our lives, it is a rhythm that we have to live with nonetheless. And here's the rhythm that we find here. It's really based on the fact that there are two kinds of people in this world. And here's what happens. Here's the rhythm that's introduced. We have these times of promise and hope, and then they're followed by times of disobedience and despair in our lives. And so we have this rhythm that's introduced to us. And we find that happens not only in individual lives, but we find that it's going to happen all throughout the life of God's people, of Israel, as we go through the Scriptures. And so over and over we have this rhythm. We find God's people, they live during a time of promise and hope. They follow God, and then they fall away from God, and they fall into this time of disobedience and despair. And then they come back, and this rhythm's created, and it goes over and over and over again. And we see that throughout the Scriptures, and we're going to see that with God's people this morning. So go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 4 this morning. And here we're going to see that all of mankind really is divided into these two groups. that cause this rhythm to occur. We see on one hand there's the promise and there's the hope that's introduced to us by Abel and by Seth. And then there's this period of disobedience and despair that's introduced to us by Cain. So let me read to you from Genesis chapter 4. You can follow along this morning as I read. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? And why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and now you are accursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest anyone who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mehujael, and Mehujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. I considered just skipping those verses because all those names in there. And Lamech took two wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who played the lyre and the pipe. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, Hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel. I knew I'd do that at some point. For Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. There's certainly a sharp contrast here, isn't there, between Cain and Abel. And we could look at that and we could kind of figure out what are some of the reasons that there's a difference there. And one thing we could kind of conclude would be to say that, well, Abel was really religious and Cain wasn't. And that was the problem there. But as we're going to see this morning, Cain was probably just as religious as his brother. It wasn't a matter of religion. Maybe it's just the fact that Cain was disobedient to God and Abel was obedient. And that's certainly true, and we're going to see that here. But I think there's something even deeper behind that. And as we usually find in the Scriptures, we find that the heart of the matter is a matter of the heart. And what we find here is that what separates out the line of Cain from the line of Abel and Seth is really what's in their heart. And the reason that some people live within this idea of promise and hope is because they have a desire to do things God's way. That's what their heart is. On the other hand, we find that people like Cain, the reason that they live in a world of disobedience and despair is that their heart is that they want to do things their way or to do things man's way. And I think this morning as we look at this passage, that's what we're going to really see, that's what that's what separates them out, and that's really what's going on here, and why Cain is cursed and why Abel and Seth are blessed. The story begins here with, as I mentioned a moment ago, with some hope. It tells us here that after Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden because of their sin, that they have a child. And they name that child Cain. And the name Cain means something like acquired or gotten. And the reason that there's so much promise here is I think that Eve names her son Cain because she really believes that Cain is the one who's fulfilling the promise that God gave back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. When He promised that her offspring would bruise the head of the evil one day. And I think she thought, man, this is the one. I've now acquired this man that God has for me. But that hope is going to go away pretty quick because it's not going to be long before Eve finds out that instead of her son being the Messiah, that he's a murderer instead. Then Adam and Eve, they have a second son. His name is Abel, and the name Abel means breath. And that's kind of almost a prophecy, isn't it? Because the life of Abel is going to be just a breath, really, on the timeline of history. It's so short there. And so they have these two sons. And we aren't really sure of the time frames here because they really aren't given to us. All we do know here is that at this time, these people lived hundreds of years. And so there's a lot of overlap between these various generations of people. For instance, we're going to see a lot of Cain's, his sons and his grandsons, they're still alive. Well, Cain's alive. He's still alive. Well, they are. So there's an overlap here. So we don't know exactly what the time frames are here. But we do know that after a period of time that Cain and Abel, that they took on different roles. That Cain was a keeper of the fields. He would go out into the fields and cultivate crops. And that Abel became a keeper of livestock. Now, what's really important to understand here is that God neither commends or says there's anything wrong with either one of those occupations. It's not the occupations here that are going to be a problem when it comes time for their offerings. Both of them were just fine in the sight of the Lord. But after a period of time, again, we don't know how long this took, but they both bring an offering to God. And as we talked about that this week on Monday morning, we said, well, this is proof that God loves steak better than vegetables. Because he takes the offering of the livestock and he rejects the one of the fruit. And we kind of joked about that, but you know what? The more I began to study this week, the more I began to look at this chapter, I think there's actually a bit of truth in that. I don't know about you, but I've always looked at this passage before, and my assumption has always been that the reason that God accepted one offering and not the other was because of how they brought it more than what they brought. It tells us here that Cain just brought some of the produce of the ground, some of the fruit, and the idea here is almost like he kind of just brought the leftovers. And Abel tells us the first fruits from his flock, which was the very best. Now, I think there's something to that, but there's something even deeper going on here than just whether they brought the best or not. I think that God had clearly set out in the previous chapter the kind of sacrifice that he would accept. And I think that over a period of time that he communicated that to Cain and to Abel through their parents. I mean, think about it. Adam and Eve had to constantly be telling the story of what had happened to them in the garden to their kids. Maybe for hundreds of years, we don't know, but for a long period of time probably here, they had heard that. And they had heard about what we saw last week in Genesis chapter 3. Remember at the end of that chapter, there's something that seems insignificant, but I think is really the key here. Remember that God covered Adam and Eve with skins made from animals? And we talked a little bit last week about why that was important, because God was pointing ahead to the time when Jesus would come and his blood would be shed to pay for the sins of the world. And the picture that God gives here, he really replaced the fig leaves, which were Adam and Eve's attempt to cover their own sin, with these animal skins to show them that their way was not the proper way, that the only way God was going to accept was to cover sins was by the killing of an innocent animal. And that's going to get carried all throughout the Old Testament in the whole system of sacrifices that God sets up there. So I really think that over time that Cain and Abel had come to understand that. But when they came to bring their offerings, Cain didn't follow that. He wanted to do it his own way. Well, Abel brought the sacrifice that God desired. And here's why I'm pretty confident of that. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, we read this. It says, "By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks." So see what it says here. It says that Abel brought his sacrifice by faith. And it seems to me the only way he could have done that is that somewhere along the line, he had to have this revelation from God that the sacrifice that God required was one of the shedding of the blood of an innocent animal. And so Abel, by faith, he believed that the way that God had prescribed, that was the proper kind of offering to bring in order to come to God. And so he does it by faith. Cain, on the other hand, he decides that, well, I'm just going to kind of do it my own way. I'm a tiller of the land, and I'm just going to bring some of my fruit to God. And the implication here in both Genesis and in Hebrews is that he did not bring his offering in faith. That he did it his own way rather than God's way. And so, not surprisingly, Cain gets pretty angry here at God. I think he gets angry at his brother too. He's mad about the fact that God won't accept his sacrifice. And he can't really take it out on God, although he does kind of point his finger in God's face. And so he takes it out on his brother. The Bible tells us that one day that Cain lures Abel out into the field and that he murders him. And I love the way that God deals with Cain here again. Reminds us so much of what we saw last week in Genesis chapter 3, doesn't it? God deals with grace and mercy with Cain, even though he commits the world's first murder here. Again, he comes and he doesn't just start hurling accusations. What does he do? He asks questions again. And as we saw last week, God never asks questions because he needs information. I mean, God knew exactly what had happened here. He didn't need Cain to tell him. But he does it for Cain's benefit. He does it so that Cain can see the sin in his life and to see what he's done. And he begins to ask these questions. And Cain, man, he wants nothing to do with God's grace and mercy. I mean, he says to God, am I my brother's keeper? I mean, come on, God. And God still, though, even after that, God still deals with him, doesn't he, in grace and mercy. He turns to him, he says, even now, Cain, even now, if you'll do well, then I'll accept you. And when he says that, I think here's what he's saying. He's saying, even now, if you're willing to come to me, if you're willing to repent, you're willing to say, God, I did it my way instead of your way. I'm sorry for that. Will you forgive me? That God is more than willing to accept him back. But in spite of the fact that time after time after time that God keeps giving Cain these second chances, that he gives him the ability to repent and to turn back to God, Cain just keeps turning around and sticking his finger in God's face and says, no way, God. I'm not going to do that. And so Cain doesn't get to experience the grace and the mercy that God's trying to give to him here. So what does God do? He imposes an appropriate punishment on Cain. He says, you know what, Cain? I'm going to take that which you've taken so much pride in, your ability to work the land, and I'm going to take that away from you. And it's really interesting. Remember last week we saw in Genesis chapter 3 that God never cursed Adam and Eve directly. He did that to the serpent. Well, here he curses Cain directly, doesn't he? So you're going to be cursed. You're not going to be able to work the ground. You thought that was so great that you'd bring me something that you created with your own hands from working the ground. Well, I'm going to take that away from you. Not only that, I'm going to make you a wanderer on the face of the earth. You're going to wander around and never be able to put down roots again. And for a farmer like Cain, that was a horrible thing, because the only way you could farm the land is you had to be able to settle somewhere and to be able to work the land there. God says, I'm going to take all that away from you. And once again, I'm amazed at Cain. He kind of thumbs his nose at God again, doesn't he? Because what does he do? It says that he goes and he settles in this land of Nod to the east. And he begins to build a city. It's almost like he's saying to God, okay, God, you told me I'm going to wander around. Guess what I'm going to do, God? I'm going to go and build me a city. And I'm going to settle down there, and I'm going to have kids, and I'm even going to name that city after my kids so that his name will stay there. And that city, something of me is going to remain in that city even after I'm gone. Cain just keeps thumbing his nose at God. He keeps turning away from God's grace and His mercy. He has a son there named Enoch, and the name Enoch means dedicated. It's really interesting later on in the life of Israel when they developed the Feast of Dedication, which is also called Hanukkah. It comes from the same root word there. It's the Feast of Dedication. So this is not, let me just point out, the same Enoch that we're going to see in Genesis chapter 5, the one who was the son of Methuselah, who was so righteous that God just took him from the earth. This is a different one. So he settles there. He names his city after his son. And then after, down the line, there's another one of his descendants that comes along, this guy named Lamech. And Lamech, he takes this sin of Cain and basically he multiplies it here. Tells us that he has two wives. This is the first instance of polygamy that we find in the Scriptures. And it's really important to note here that God doesn't condone that. God doesn't say that's okay. As a matter of fact, we know from what we saw in Genesis chapter 1 that this is a perversion of what God wanted. God said that a man shall be separated from his father and mother and be united to a woman, back in Genesis chapter 1. That was always God's plan from the beginning. So Lamech, he takes this to a whole new thing. And the name Lamech is kind of interesting. We don't know exactly what it means. It's kind of an obscure Hebrew word, but it probably means something like this: to be set low or to be laid low. And as I said, Lamech takes this idea of sin to a whole new level here. Not only does he take on a second wife, but then he goes around and he not only sins, but he begins to boast about his sin. You see the song that he sings there in Genesis chapter 4? Probably the first song that we sing in the Bible. Well, it's a song about killing people. Can you believe that? I mean, some of these rappers and stuff today that sing about that same kind of stuff, they don't have anything on Lamech. He says that I even killed a boy for striking me. He brags about his sin. And not only that, he mocks God, because remember, God had put this mark on Cain so that anyone would come along and try to kill Cain. It's God's grace and mercy. He said, man, if anyone tries to avenge what you've done, that I'm going to get him sevenfold. And he comes along and goes, man, if anyone tries to get me, I'm going to get him 77-fold. What he's really saying there, he's mocking God and saying, I'm even stronger than God is. So Lamech takes this sin to a whole new level that we've never seen up until this point on the earth. But aren't you glad that this chapter ends again with some hope? Remember I said there's a cycle here. It began with Cain, who looked like it was full of hope. He turns out to be a murderer. So now there's this life of disobedience and despair. Well, it comes back to hope. The cycle comes back around again at the end of the chapter. And it's a great picture of the faith of Adam and Eve here. I mean, think about it. Think about it from Eve's perspective for a minute. She had this son who she thought was the promised Messiah, and the guy turns out to be a murderer instead. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had a kid like that, I'd be pretty tempted to not have any more kids after that. But Adam and Eve, say, you know what? Here's the command God's given us. He said to be fruitful and to multiply. He's promised that He's going to send a deliverer through the offspring of Eve. So let's just obey God. Let's just trust what God's told us to do. And they do that. And God gives them another son, a son named Seth. And what a picture that is of their hope. It tells us there that the name Seth means something like appointed. And here's what Eve said to herself. She said, God has appointed to me this replacement for Abel. And there was this hope there that the Messiah would come through that line. And sure enough, the Messiah comes through that line. If you look in Luke chapter 3 and you go back and you read the genealogy of Jesus there, it's traced all the way back to Seth. So there's a picture of the coming of the Messiah that we find right here in this passage. So once again this morning, as we look at this story, as we look at this account, I want us to pull a couple of things out of here. I want us to see what this teaches us about God and what it teaches us about man. And we're going to find that some of those things are going to be, pretty similar to what we saw last week. But there's a couple new nuances, a couple new revelations that we find here. So let's look, first of all, at what this passage teaches us about God. Excuse me. First thing we see here is the same thing that we saw last week. That God is a God of love and grace and mercy. We see how time after time after time that He offers Cain this ability to have joy in a relationship with Him if he just turned back to God. But at the same time, we also see here that God is a God of justice. That He has to punish the sin that's going on there. We also see here God's sovereignty. I mean, just when it seems that, that God's promise has been broken forever, God comes on the scene and He gives Adam and Eve another son, Seth. So we saw those things last week, but here's what I want us to see this week, something extra, and that is that God is a God of second chances. Dave, I think you need to go a couple of slides ahead there, if you can. God is a God of second chances. Really of third and fourth and fifth chances if you want to get right down to it. He just keeps, Cain turns his back on God and walks away. And God says, Cain, I'll give you another chance. And he turns his back and walks away from God. And God says, Cain, I want to give you another chance. And so over and over, that's the nature of God. We're going to see it all throughout the Scriptures. The way that God deals with individuals and the way that He deals with His people, Israel, is He gives them second and third and fourth and fifth chances. Because He's a gracious and loving God. This is part of God's grace and mercy. But we also see here that at some point there's going to come a time when God's going to say enough is enough. He did that with Cain. He finally said, God, I've given you so many chances. Enough is enough. I'm going to put punishment on you. And that's going to be true in our lives as well. And here's the thing. None of us know when that time is. Only God does. And so the thing is, we better take advantage of those second chances while we have them now, because who knows how long they're going to last. So God is a God of second chances. What does this passage tell us about man? What does it tell us about you and about me? Well, we see here once again that this passage tells us that man has the ability to make choices, doesn't he? God gives Cain and Abel. He tells them, you guys decide what offering that you'll bring to me. I've given you what my standards are, but now it's your choice. And then even after that, He still gives Cain the choice time after time. Cain, if you can still choose to return to me, you can still choose to return to me. And time after time, Cain turns his back on God. So it tells us here that it gives us a chance to make choices. It also tells us that man's natural tendency is to try to do things his own way. See, without Jesus, we saw this in Romans, That without Jesus in our lives, without faith in Jesus, that's our natural way to do things. We want to do things our own way. We don't want to do things God's way. And without faith in Jesus, the fact is that all of us are slaves to sin. And we clearly see that here with Cain. He was a slave to his own sin here. So what does that mean for my life? I want to share with you this morning as we close just one implication for my life. There's probably a lot of things, but here's what I think is the most important. And here's this. I need to live by faith and not by my feelings. That's really the difference in living according to God's way, which is faith, or my way, which is my feelings. That was the problem Cain had. He got carried away by his emotions, especially by his anger we see here. But he allowed his life to be controlled by those emotions. And Abel and Seth, on the other hand, we see they allow their lives to be controlled not by their feelings, but by their faith. They trust in what God says even when it doesn't make sense. And I think that's probably the best test that we can take and apply to our lives to determine, am I really living by faith or am I living by my feelings? When we look at those things in the Scriptures that might not make a whole lot of sense to us, to our finite human minds, we have a choice. Will I trust that what God says here is true, that that's going to be the best for my life? Will I live by faith, or am I going to live on the basis of my feelings? Let me give you just a couple of examples of how that might play out in our lives. First of all, obviously it deals with the whole way that we come to God in the first place, doesn't it? I mean, my feelings say, well, I want to have this emotional experience to come to God. So I'm going to do things my way. Because of my pride, I'm going to do all these great things for God. And because of that, God's going to feel really good about me and He's going to accept me. I mean, that's what we'd like to think. But what God says, no, what you have to do instead, you have to trust in what Jesus has done for you. There's absolutely nothing that you can do on your own to come to me. It's only faith in Jesus that's going to bring you there. So you do that. How about with your finances? When you get to the end of the month and you just don't see how your bills are going to be paid, do you let worry, do you let fear keep you from doing what the Scriptures have commanded, what Jesus said, to store up treasure for yourself in heaven, what it says in Proverbs to bring the first fruits of your work and offer those to God? So again, you have a choice. Am I going to live based on my feelings, or am I going to have faith in God and trust that if I'll do what He tells me to do, that He'll provide for my needs, because that's what He said He would do? How about the whole rhythm that we talked about back at the beginning of this idea of working 6 days and then taking a day off? You know, am I going to trust that if I work 6 days and take a day of rest, that God's going to provide for my needs? Or am I going to just keep working 7 days every week because I just don't see how I'm going to make ends meet otherwise? There's a lot of ways, I think, that we can take and look at this in our lives. How about when someone insults me? I mean, if I respond in feelings, what am I going to do? I'm going to turn right back and insult them back. You know, either face to face or on Twitter or somewhere else. I'm going to go out and I'm going to respond and I'm going to get back at them some way. But what does the Bible say? 1 Peter 3:9 says that when someone insults you, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to turn around and give them a blessing instead. So am I going to trust God and do that, or am I going to act according to my feelings and do that? How about when someone harms me or harms someone that I love? Am I going to operate according to my feelings and turn around and get revenge against someone else? Or am I going to trust God to do that, and am I going to forgive the other person? See, there's a lot of those things that we can do, and I think that's the best test. And here's what we find. If we're going to live according to faith, then we can have that life that's full of promise and hope. But if we're going to live according to our feelings, we're going to have a life that's going to be characterized by disobedience and despair. Now, given the choice, I'm pretty sure which of those two we would choose, right? Anyone here want to live a life full of disobedience and despair? Not me. I want to live a life that's full of promise and hope. And the way that I do that is to make sure that I have a heart that desires to do things God's way and not my way. Let's pray.